The moon was low in the sky, creating ghostly shadows across the barren area around the old institution. The weeds that clung to the crumbling building's damaged exterior rustled in the brisk breeze. It seemed as though the air itself reverberated with the hushed cries of long-forgotten sufferers. Attractive as its gloomy image was, the facility had enticed 5 urban adventurers that night. Stories of unimaginable tragedies, questionable experiments, and restless ghosts had circulated about the location for decades. Curiosity had won out over caution in spite of the no trespassing signs and other warnings. Sarah, the photographer with a taste for the macabre, was there, as was Mark, the skeptic who always had a reasonable explanation for everything, and 3 others: Rachel, the history buff, Mike, the thrill seeker, and Emily, who was always up for a good scare. They stood in front of the huge worn doors, their lights cutting through the pitch black inside. Sarah had her camera hanging around her neck, ready to snap photos of any scary scenes that could unfold. She paused for a moment of reflection before continuing. "Let's stay together and be cautious. Remember, we're here for the experience. It's anyone's guess what we'll run into." Mark rolled his eyes and laughed at the idea. "Spirits and the dead? Oh, come on, Sarah. This is merely an old, abandoned structure." Mark's cynicism began to wane as they pushed through the old doors and entered the dimly lighted entry hall of the facility. The walls were covered with fading wallpaper that was flaking off like the skin of a dead body, and the air inside smelled musty. A foreboding echo reverberated off the walls as they walked, and the dust in the hall swirled in the light of their headlights. The history buff Rachel couldn't hide her enthusiasm. "It's like walking inside a time capsule, dudes. You can only imagine the tales that these walls could tell. If thrill seeker Mike had his way, the trip wouldn't be complete without his saying, 'Well, I hope they tell us something spooky, or this will be a boring trip.'" Strange things started happening as they probed further. Sarah's camera suddenly broke down, showing horrifyingly distorted pictures of warped faces and ethereal beings. Even though no one was in sight, Emily felt a cold touch brush over her arm. Mark's suspicious grin faded as he struggled to make sense of what was happening. The gang continued to explore the maze-like passageways of the facility. Eerie shadows flickered at the periphery of their vision, cast by the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. They caught a whiff of something like a whispered conversation carried by the air's ethereal currents. There was a tremor in Emily's voice as she said, "Did anyone else hear that?" Mark took a deep breath, his doubts dissipating with every passing second. "Yeah, I heard it," he said, his voice now carrying a note of worry. A door ahead of them in the hall creaked open suddenly. Sarah focused her camera on the entrance as they warily approached. When they stepped through the door, they were transported to a timeless space. In the middle of the room was an old rusty operating table flanked by other pieces of antiquated medical equipment. Rachel flinched. "The room you're in looks like an operating room. It has been rumored that lobotomies were done here." A desk with old patient records was illuminated by their torches. With her voice shaking, Emily chose a file at random and read it out loud. Subject 37, no name given, involuntarily committed due to severe hallucinations and aggressive behavior. Transorbital lobotomy is the method used. Death date. The prospect of the date made her voice drop off. That night's date had repeated itself several years later. A deep guttural moan resounded across the room and the temperature dropped dramatically. As they discovered there were others, panic set in. The shadows shifted and writhed in the corners, and the heavy air made it feel like they were sinking. Once again, Sarah's camera failed her, and this time the warped photographs showed disturbing sights of insanity and pain. Mark's mistrust melted away when they were confronted with the chilling reality that the facility housed terrible mysteries beyond their ken. The voices of the lost patients, their tortured spirits imprisoned behind these crumbling walls, could be heard in the dim light. The gang looked at each other in horror as they realized they had entered a nightmare from which there was no escape. To what extent would they be able to maintain their sanity while evading the asylum's grasp remained an open issue. The explorers stood shivering in horror as the room's eerie coolness persisted. Sarah's camera dangled around her neck, its pictures appearing to document the horrible history of the facility. The evil energy in the room intensified, becoming heavy with pain. Rachel held the patient's file so hard that her knuckles became white. "We had to get going." Her voice trembled as she said, "This place is cursed." Mike was torn since he always seeks excitement. "I mean, this is why we came, right, Rach?" Wow, it was the genuine deal. On the other hand, Emily's anxiety was mounting. "Guys, I'm not sure about this. The atmosphere here is just off. Mark, who used to be the cynic, is now the one who needs an explanation for everything. Perhaps a draft is to blame for the chill and the camera disturbance. There must be some rationale to this." The room suddenly went dark as he continued speaking. The lights on their flashlights began to dim and then go out, leaving them in the dark and with no sound. Fearful, they frantically searched for their phones to use as flashlights. It was only in the faint light of their screens that they realized the room had changed. A slimy black ooze that pulsed and writhed like a living thing covered the rusty surgery table. Once damaged and rusty, the medical equipment now looked brand new and dangerous. Even without her equipment, Sarah, the photographer, felt compelled to record this nightmare. She took shots with her phone, the bright lights illuminating hidden details. Those with stretched bodies and contorted expressions pressed up against the walls. From the shadows came a whispering voice. "We need your assistance." The people in the group stopped moving and found it difficult to breathe. As in, did anyone else hear that? Emily's eyes were wide with fear as she murmured. Mark's reply was a little shaky, but he managed to say, "I heard it, everybody heard it." It was as though the room itself sensed their terror. There was a groaning sound from the walls, and the black stuff on the operating table flowed and spread out in horrifying tentacles. The explorers felt themselves being dragged closer and closer to the table as if by some unseen power. Mike's courage had given way to his desperation, and he said, "We have to get out of here." He made a mad dash for the door, but it slammed shut on him and them with a thunderous thud. Fear spread as the situation in the room deteriorated rapidly. The explorers heard the pleading sounds of the victims increase in volume. Around them, shadows swirled crazily, and malice permeated the air. Sarah's hands were shaking, but she managed to take a few more photographs with the flash on her phone before the battery died. She caught a glimpse of the phantom creatures closing in on her, their faces contorted in agony, in one of her dying glimpses. The explorers were pressed together, each feeling the other's pulses. They were held captive by powers beyond their comprehension in a chamber that defied logic. The asylum was now alive, and it craved their terror, sanity, and very souls. The eerie mutterings filled the room, and the monstrous presence pressed in on them, and they realized they were trapped in a nightmare from which they might never awaken. The passage of time seemed warped and devoid of significance there. Fear gripped the adventurers as they gathered together in the oppressive blackness. The sounds of the asylum's tortured inmates became louder and more desperate, a cacophony of sorrow that could only lead to insanity. Sarah's thoughts were racing as she looked for an escape. The door wouldn't budge, and their dead phones wouldn't help them get out. Her camera was the only hope she had, and her hands shook as she grabbed for it. She struggled mightily to activate the camera's flimsy LED light. The little light barely penetrated the thick gloom, but it was enough to see the looks of horror on her companions' faces. Their breathing was rapid and frantic. Once the unwavering skeptic, Mark was now a shattered shadow of his former self. "I was wrong," he said, his voice shaking. "This is not a typical setting. Nothing about this makes any sense." Rachel clutched the patient file to her chest, her gaze darting anxiously across the room. You can hear the speaker saying, "We have to find a way out, or we'll end up like those poor souls in these files." Sarah looked around the room with the weak light from her camera and saw a faint, almost invisible glow coming from a corner. Like a guiding light, it caught her eye. She waved her hand towards the others. "Take a look over there. I think I see something." They approached the source of the light very carefully. It was a little box with elaborate carvings all around it. Curiosity triumphing over apprehension, Emily grabbed for it and cautiously opened the lid. They opened it up and discovered a pair of worn-out keys inside. They gave off an unearthly vibe as the dim light seemed to come from within them. the finding seems to have been led to them by the facility itself. Mike reached for the keys, his tone suddenly infused with resolve. This may be our escape route. Let's get out of here before we're eaten alive. The sounds of the tortured souls followed them as they left the foreboding room, but their cries faded more and further away the further they went. The evil aura of the institution followed them, yet the keys offered hope of freedom. As they made their way back through the maze of passageways, the stifling air began to ease slightly. The asylum still had work for them to do. Doors came and disappeared as if directed by a malevolent intellect, and the walls seemed to twist and turn about them. They were frightened, but they kept going because they wanted freedom so much. They felt the watchful gaze of many lost souls as the asylum's gloomy past pressed down upon them. A massive iron door greeted them after what seemed like an age. Mike nervously reached for the matching iron key on his keychain and turned it in the lock. The creaking door opened to show a twisting, narrow stairway heading down into the asylum's depths. Despite understanding that they were escaping one horror and into another, they plunged forward into the abyss. The asylum's hold on them was still strong, and the horrors that lay in wait below ground would put their strength and sanity to tests they could not have imagined. They were reminded that they were not alone in this desolate place by the sounds of the lost souls that rang in their ears as they went deeper into the asylum's murky center. As the explorers went farther inside the institution, the tiny, winding stairway seemed to go on forever. Shaky, ghostly shadows danced over the wet, crumbling walls as Sarah's camera flashed. Even though they were physically moving away from the eerie chamber, they couldn't escape the impression that they were actually sinking further into the abyss. As they walked farther into the institution, the suffocating mood grew. The temperature dropped, and it felt as though the structure itself was conspiring to keep them there. A chilling reminder of the asylum's sad past. The voices of the dead could still be heard in their heads. As her voice sank to a whisper, Emily clenched her chest. I just can't handle it any longer. It's as though the night is slowly soaking into my very being. Once the group's voice of reason, Mark now felt as uneasy as the rest of them. We need to get out of here and stop this nightmare once and for all. Whatever works, as long as it does. This place cannot be allowed to consume us. They continued to down what appeared to be an infinite stairway. They may as well have walked into a maze that defied geometry and logic. Slick with moisture, the walls gave out an odor of rotting. Sarah's camera sputtered, and an alarming battery warning blinked on and off. There wasn't much time left, and she knew it, so she prepared herself for the impending night. She sped up, wanting to get out of there quickly. Finally making it to the bottom of the stairwell, the explorers looked around to see that they were in a huge underground cavern. What they saw before them was a horrific display of human misery. The walls were lined with rows of rusty, decaying cages that formerly held human beings. There were skeletons in the cages, their empty eyes staring out at the world. Their threadbare clothing clung to their gaunt bodies as their bony limbs pleaded for help. The discovery of the forgotten victims of the Asylum's deadliest experiments was a disturbing one. Rachel's voice shook with shock as she let out a cry. The place where they were being held, my God. Those patients who refused to check out. The wrath in Mike's voice made him mumble, "We need to get out of here. What a terrifying place this is." But just as they were about to depart, a piercing scream could be heard. When they turned back, Emily was pointing in fright at one of the cages. Something that looked more ghostly than human leaned up against the bars. It was one of the tortured inmates who had broken out of the asylum. With bony, twisted fingers, the creature gestured toward them, its eyes filled with indescribable yearning. Sarah's camera died with a last flutter, capturing the ghostly image. Mark drew closer, his voice soft with empathy. Our hands are tied. We're in the same situational bind that you are. But the figure's distress deepened and a wailing wail echoed across the room. It was as though it held them responsible for the horrors that had taken place within these four walls and their subsequent misery. The walls of the chamber began to close in on them suddenly, the cages shutting like the jaws of a monster. The realization that they were trapped once again, this time with the tortured souls from the institution, caused them to panic. The explorers could feel the asylum's darkness engulfing them, body and soul, as the walls closed in and the ghostly forms pressed in. They were trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape, doomed to join the ranks of the inmates who had been lost to the asylum's dark past.